The night Miss Cecily Morrow walked into Hargrove Assembly Rooms was the night she had decided, with a clarity that steadied her hands, that she would not look afraid. She had worn her best gown, which was not a fine one. The dress was 2 winters old, the ivory silk let out at the seams by her own needle, the hem newly pressed with a flat iron borrowed from Mrs. Gill downstairs. She had arranged her hair herself, which meant it was neat rather than fashionable. She had no diamonds. She wore on a ribbon at her left wrist a small seal ring that had belonged to her father, the gold worn thin at the band, the device too small to read from a distance. She had worn it every day since his death. She wore it tonight because it was the last piece of him that Sir Edmund Foss had not found a way to take. The assembly room was warm and bright, all candlelight and the low roar of 300 conversations conducted at the precise pitch required to carry just far enough without seeming to shout. Cecily stood at the door for a moment while her eyes adjusted, long enough to feel the room register her arrival in the way rooms had learned to register her this season. A pause. A recession. A few deliberate turnings away. Lady Haverwick, stationed near the central column with the authority of a woman who had occupied that position for 30 seasons and saw no reason to yield it, did not turn away. She turned toward, which was, in its own fashion, worse. "Miss Morrow," she said, and her voice carried in the particular way of voices accustomed to being listened to. "I had not expected to see the forger's daughter so bold as to come tonight." The woman beside Lady Haverwick made a small sound. It was not quite a gasp, and not quite an agreement. It was the sound a room makes when it is uncertain whether to condemn what it has just witnessed or to endorse it. Cecily met the woman's gaze for 3 full seconds. She did not smile. She did not flinch. She said, "Good evening, Lady Haverwick," and walked into the room. What she did not see, because she was watching the floor in front of her feet, rather than the far edge of the room, was the man at the column near the musician's alcove who had stopped mid-sentence when she came through the door. She did not see his head turn. She did not see him go very still in the way of a man whose attention has locked onto something he had not expected to find here. She did not see, when Lady Haverwick spoke her label aloud, the brief change that moved across his face before he disciplined it back into order. Nicholas Vane, Viscount Aldermere, had been in the middle of a conversation about drainage rights on his father's property in Shropshire. He could not, afterward, have said what he replied. He was watching Cecily Morrow cross Hargrove Assembly Rooms, with her chin level and her spine straight and her gown 2 seasons out of date. And something that had been forming in him for 3 weeks settled into a decision. He had the letter. He had had it for 3 weeks. He needed to choose what to do with it tonight. She did not know he existed. That would have to change. The accusation had come 5 months ago, in January, when the ground was still frozen, and her father had been dead not 6 weeks. Thomas Morrow had been a solicitor of modest reputation and great personal scruple, which combination had not made him wealthy, but had made him trusted. He had worked for 22 years in partnership with Sir Edmund Foss, who handled the commercial engagements, while Thomas handled the letters of administration, the property conveyances, the careful work of legal writing that required a man who meant what he set down on paper. They had not been intimate friends. Thomas Morrow had found Sir Edmund charming in the way one finds a well-made piece of furniture charming, with appreciation for the craft and no particular warmth toward the maker. He had not, as it turned out, understood Sir Edmund at all. The document that had appeared in the Court of Chancery in February bore Thomas Morrow's signature on a debt acknowledgment of £3,000, dated 9 months before his death, in which Thomas had apparently borrowed the sum from Foss and secured it against the lease of the firm's offices and the income from 4 estate clients who paid retaining fees. The document, if valid, meant that the business passed entirely into Foss's hands upon Thomas's death, and that Cecily, as her father's only surviving heir, inherited nothing. Cecily had known immediately that her father had not signed it. She had handled his correspondence for 4 years, organized his files, copied letters to clients in a fair hand when his own handwriting grew unsteady. She knew the precise pressure of his signature, the particular lean of his capital letters, the way he formed the loop of his given name. The signature on the document was an approximation that would have fooled anyone who had not grown up watching the man sign his name. The problem was that this description fit almost no one. His own solicitor was recently dead. The witnesses on the document were men she could not locate. Sir Edmund had the original, and Sir Edmund had friends. By March, she had been told by 2 separate advisors that the case was not worth pursuing without evidence she did not have. By April, the offices had been transferred. By May, the season had opened, and she was not in it, because one did not invite the daughter of a man whose name had been made a scandal to one's drawing room, to one's musicale, to one's assembly. One simply did not. She had found work through an old family connection, a printer named Quill, who published legal pamphlets and required someone with a reading knowledge of Latin and a tolerance for small type. She worked 3 days a week in a room at the back of his shop in Fleet Street, reading proofs, marking errors, earning enough to keep her rooms and send a small sum each month to her father's housekeeper, who had stayed in the empty house in Hampstead rather than leave a place where she had lived for 19 years. She wore her father's ring every day. It was not valuable. It was his. Evenings she read law. She was not qualified to practice it. She understood that. She read it anyway, looking for something she might have missed, some procedure or precedent that would give her what she needed. She had found nothing yet. She had not stopped looking. She had come tonight because a woman from her father's old congregation had written to say that one was expected to hold one's head up, and that the moment one stopped appearing in company was the moment the world decided one had admitted guilt. Cecily thought it was also possible that the moment one kept appearing was the moment the world simply found new occasions to demonstrate how little one mattered. She was not sure which proposition was correct. She had come anyway, because the alternative was to stay in her room and let Sir Edmund Foss have the season as well as the offices. If anyone in Hargrove assembly rooms that evening happened to notice a man near the musician's alcove, whose eyes tracked the woman in ivory silk with a regularity that, if pointed out to him, he would have denied, they did not remark upon it. There were any number of things one did not remark upon at assemblies. This was one of them. The bribe had come to the printer's shop 3 weeks earlier, on a Thursday morning, when the rain outside was the fine, relentless variety that soaked through cloth and discouragement in equal measure. Cecily had arrived to find Mr. Quill absent, which was not unusual. What was unusual was the man waiting in the outer office, a person she did not recognize, well dressed in the manner of a servant of a very good house, who introduced himself as Mr. Carey and explained that he represented a client who understood she had been working to recover her father's estate and who felt she might benefit from accepting a more practical arrangement. The arrangement, as Mr. Carey laid it out with the smooth economy of a man who had delivered this speech before, was as follows. A sum of £500 would be placed in her name at a bank to be designated. In exchange, she would sign a brief document acknowledging that the debt had been validly incurred and that her father's estate had passed to its rightful claimant. £500 was more than she would earn in 3 years at the rate Mr. Quill was paying her. "No," she said. Mr. Carey looked at her. He had the expression of a man accustomed to being told no as an opening position. "Miss Morrow, I think if you consider your situation with some care, you will find that £500 represents a fair resolution of a matter that cannot otherwise be resolved in your favor." "I said no," she said again. Her voice was level. Her hands were flat on the desk in front of her. My father did not sign that document. I will not say that he did. Not for £500, and not for 5,000. Tell whoever sent you that they have wasted a wet Thursday morning. Mr. Carey looked at her for a moment longer. Then he picked up his hat, replaced it on his head with the deliberateness of a man reassessing whether further argument would serve, and left. She did not know that a man had come in from the street 5 minutes before Mr. Carey's arrival and had stood at the shelf of printed pamphlets near the door in a manner that suggested he was reading the titles, which he was not. She did not know that Nicholas Vane, Viscount Aldermere, had been in Fleet Street that morning on his own business, had recognized the servant's livery as belonging to Sir Edmund Foss's household, and had followed the man inside out of something between instinct and the particular alertness of a person who has already been waiting for a situation to announce itself. He had heard everything. He had watched her hands on the desk. He had seen the exact quality of her refusal. The kind that was not temper or indignation, but something quieter and more durable. A refusal rooted in what she knew to be true, rather than in what she wanted for herself. He had seen the ring on the ribbon at her wrist catch the gray morning light when she spread her palms flat. He had been carrying her father's letter for 18 days by then. He had found it in a bundle of papers forwarded to him by a colleague who was settling the estate of Thomas Morrow's old solicitor, a man named Hartley, who had died in November and whose papers had been in a locked box for 3 months. The letter was dated the 8th of October, 3 weeks before Thomas Morrow's death, addressed to Hartley, and contained, among other items of estate business, a precise accounting of the firm's finances, along with an explicit notation that no such debt as later appeared in the Chancery document had existed. Thomas had written it in the careful way of a man who was not well and wanted his affairs to be understood. He had noted the date. He had noted the amounts. He had described, with characteristic exactitude, that he owed Foss nothing, and that Foss had borrowed from him some years back and repaid it in full. The letter was not by itself a verdict. Aldermere knew the law well enough to know that it needed to be set before the right person at the right moment to do the work it was capable of doing. He had been waiting for the right moment. Watching her refuse the bribe, he understood that waiting was not a gift he could continue offering. If there is a turn in a story that you feel in your chest before the mind has named it, stay close. The turn was coming. He left the printer's shop before she came out from the back room. He walked into the rain. He began to consider how one arranges the right moment when one has arranged nothing with the woman at the center of it, who does not know he exists. He had managed to be introduced at Lady Caversham's small evening party the following week, which required no particular effort, because they moved in adjacent circles, and the absence of a prior introduction had always been a matter of occasion rather than intention. The occasion presented itself in the form of a mutual acquaintance, Mr. Alford, who made the introduction with the casual goodwill of a man who could not have known he was doing anything of consequence. "Miss Morrow," Aldermere said, and she turned and looked at him with the expression of a woman who had learned to prepare for hostility from strangers and was briefly recalibrating because he had done nothing hostile. "Lord Aldermere," she said, which meant she recognized the name. She would have recognized the name. He was, through his father's standing and his own quiet practice of reading law and advising on difficult cases, the sort of person whose name appeared in the pages of legal periodicals and in the drawing rooms of people who were engaged in proceedings they could not afford to lose. She knew the name. She did not know why he was speaking to her. He found a reason to stand near her at the beverage table. He found a reason to walk to the bookcase when she did. He did not explain himself. He asked her instead about the pamphlet she had been proofing when he had visited Quill's shop the previous week. Because he had in fact been to Quill's shop the previous week and had in fact glanced at the pamphlet she was working on, which was a comparison of two conflicting precedents on adverse possession, and he was genuinely interested in it. She looked at him for 3 full seconds before answering. Then she answered. He found that she had read more law in the past 5 months, out of necessity and without formal instruction, than some men he knew who had been called to the bar. She spoke of precedent with the care of someone who understood it as a living mechanism, rather than a collection of anecdotes. She did not tell him about her own case. She would not have thought it appropriate. He did not ask. He listened to her speak about adverse possession, and felt with a clarity he had not expected, that he had been thinking about the wrong question. He had been asking himself, when was the right moment to produce the letter? He should have been asking himself what the right moment required of him. Sir Edmund Foss was at Lady Caversham's that evening as well, which Aldermere had known before he arrived. Because Foss was the sort of man who placed himself at events where one needed to be seen. He crossed the room at one point and passed near where Cecily and Aldermere stood, and he looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he has already solved and finds tedious for continuing to present itself. "Miss Morrow," he said, without slowing, still persisting. "I admire the spirit, if not the judgment." She did not look at him. She looked at the middle distance and let a long breath pass through her nose. "The forger's daughter," said Sir Edmund, not quite under his breath, 2 steps to the left, and the syllables landed with the precise weight of a man who has said a thing before and found it useful, and Cecily's spine straightened by 1 degree. Aldermere said, "Walk with me to the window." It was not a question. She looked at him. "The air is better there," he said, which was not true. It was an assembly room in May, and the windows were closed. She knew this. He knew she knew. There was a beat in which she decided something. She walked with him to the window. He had been a widower for 4 years. Eleanor had been 26 when the accusation was made against her, a quiet woman of good sense and a talent for watercolor, who had had the misfortune of being present at the signing of a document that her brother had later claimed was fraudulent, though it was not. The accusation had been a matter of a disputed inheritance in her family, which had nothing to do with Eleanor, except that her signature appeared as witness on the original conveyance, and her brother wished to render the document void. She had been in good health when the case began. She had been pale by the 2nd month and coughing by the 3rd, and she had said, each time he visited, that she was quite well, and he had believed her because believing her was easier than considering the alternative. Aldermere had found the proof. He had found it 3 months after the accusation was first lodged, a letter from a notary who had been present and who confirmed the signing was in order. He had sent it to the appropriate party. He had trusted the procedure to move at the pace procedures moved. He had spent 10 days following up with the correct office. He had spent another fortnight waiting for a response. He had been patient in the way of a man who has always found patience to be a professional virtue, who has won cases by outlasting the other side's willingness to be careful. Eleanor had died of a fever in the 4th month of the case. She had died with the accusation unresolved, still formally a matter before the courts, still technically pending. She had died with the whisper still attached to her name. He had not been at her bedside. He had been at a meeting with her solicitor, which he had thought was the thing she needed most. He had the proof when she died. He had not moved fast enough with it. That was the truth of it, the specific weighted sentence he had carried for 4 years. He had the proof, and he had believed in the machinery of correct procedure, and he had not put the proof into the right hands at the right moment, because he had thought there was more time. There was always more time. Until there was not. There was a portrait in his study of Eleanor that he kept turned 3/4 to the wall, not because he wished to forget her, but because looking at it directly still carried the quality of looking at something he had broken. She was looking at something just outside the frame in the portrait, with an expression of patient waiting, and he could not determine whether the painter had intended it that way or whether he only read it that way now. He kept a letter she had written him in the drawer of his desk, folded in thirds. He did not read it often. He did not need to read it to know what it said. What it said was, "I know you are doing everything correctly. I know you will find the right answer. I am so glad to have a man beside me who knows how the machinery works." He had told none of this to Cecily Morrow. He had told it to no one in 4 years. He told it now in the only way he could manage, which was not in words, but in the decision forming in him. Nightly, since the printer's shop. The decision that had become iron in his chest by the time he asked her to walk to the window. And she had looked at him and decided something. He was not going to wait for the correct procedural moment. He was going to make the moment correct. A boy. Hargrove Assembly Rooms. On the evening 3 weeks after the printer's shop, and 1 week after Lady Caversham's party, held the better part of the season's active membership, which was to say it held a great many people who had been present in November, when Sir Edmund Foss had first brought his petition forward in a semi-public setting at a Michaelmas dinner, and named Thomas Morrow's daughter as the person who had fabricated her own father's estate documents for personal gain. The same room. The same approximate attendance. This was not an accident. Sir Edmund had invited, specifically, the people who had heard him speak in November, and he had done so because he expected the evening to provide an occasion for a different kind of announcement. Cecily had come in by the side door, which was not the entrance most people used, but was the entrance nearest to the street, where she had descended from a hackney carriage, because she could not afford a private carriage and did not own one. She had not known Lord Aldermere would be here. She had not known Sir Edmund had orchestrated the attendance list. She had known only that she needed to come, again, because she was still standing, and because the only argument against Sir Edmund Foss that she currently possessed was the evidence of herself, present, not broken, still wearing her father's ring on a ribbon at her wrist. She had been in the room for perhaps 20 minutes when she encountered Mrs. Radcliffe, who was a woman of reasonable social standing and unreasonable commitment to the useful delivery of information she had no business delivering. "My dear," Mrs. Radcliffe said, lowering her voice to the register that indicated she believed she was doing a kindness. "I am sorry to tell you that Sir Edmund has petitioned the magistrate. They are saying an officer will be sent. They are saying he may come tonight. It is a matter of the forger's daughter, you understand. The petition was presented 2 days ago." Cecily stood very still. She had not known about the petition. She had thought she had more time. She had thought, in the way of someone who has been doing everything correctly and believes that eventually correct behavior will produce a result, that she was still finding her footing. She looked across the room to where she had last seen Lord Aldermere. He was standing near the Foss family party, which included Sir Edmund himself, large and comfortable in his position, and Miss Portia Foss in a gown the color of a clear winter sky, her hand on a glass, her expression the composed expression of a woman who has been told this evening will go in a particular direction and is wearing the correct dress for it. Aldermere was in their orbit. He was, as far as Cecily could see from this distance, listening to something Sir Edmund was saying. She had been foolish. She understood this now. She had let herself begin to believe that someone was paying attention to her for reasons that were not pity or curiosity or the particular cruelty of prolonged social observation. She had let herself think about the window seat at Lady Caversham's party, and the conversation about adverse possession, and the way he had looked at her father's ring without explaining why. She had thought it meant something. She had been the forger's daughter long enough to know that believing things meant something was how you ended up standing in an assembly room watching the man you had allowed yourself to trust, standing with the family of the man who had destroyed yours. The room was very warm. The candles were very bright. She turned to look for the side door. She did not reach it. The sound that preceded everything was not a dramatic one. It was simply the sound of a man crossing a room at the pace of a man who has decided where he is going and sees no reason to arrive at anything other than a deliberate speed. Nicholas Vane, Viscount Aldermere, had been listening to Sir Edmund Foss describe the evening's expected proceedings with the expression of a man absorbing information, which was the expression he had been cultivating for 3 years in professional settings, and which allowed him to hear things that were not intended for him to act upon. Sir Edmund had been describing, with the satisfaction of a man describing a finished piece of work, that he had arranged for a magistrate's officer to attend this evening, that the matter of Miss Morrow's forgery would be formally noted before witnesses, that the whole tedious business would be concluded before the supper interval. Aldermere had looked at Miss Portia Foss, who was looking at her glass with the expression of a woman who considered the evening already won. He had looked at Sir Edmund, who was looking at the room with the expression of a man who had been right about everything for 30 years, and could not conceive of the evening working any other way. He had looked across the room to Cecily Morrow, who had gone very still, and was looking at him with an expression that he recognized, because he had worn it himself, once, 4 years ago, when he had understood that he had miscalculated the time remaining. He said, "Excuse me," to Sir Edmund, and he crossed the room. It took 11 steps. He counted them afterward. In the particular way one counts things one wants to remember precisely. 11 steps across a well-lit assembly room with 300 people in it, and the crowd parted in the manner crowds part for a man of his bearing when he is walking as if the floor belongs to him. He stopped in front of her. She said nothing. He understood from the quality of her silence that she thought she knew what he was about to say, and that she was preparing to receive it with the kind of dignity that is the last resource of a person who has used everything else. "Miss Morrow," he said. "Lord Aldermere," she said, and her voice did not waver, which cost her something visible only in the set of her jaw. He reached into his coat. He produced a letter, folded in thirds and sealed, which he had been carrying in his breast pocket for 3 weeks, next to his heart in the way of a man who has decided that the time for proper procedure has passed. He held it out to her. She looked at it. "Your father wrote it 6 weeks before his death," he said. "It was in Hartley's papers. It names the precise state of his accounts at the time of signing. It notes, specifically, that no debt existed between himself and Sir Edmund Foss." She looked at the letter. She looked at him. Her hand came up and she took it, and he felt the moment she registered that it was real, that the paper in her hand had come from her father's hand, that the handwriting on the outside was the handwriting she had grown up watching, because her eyes closed for 1 second, and then opened again. The magistrate's officer, a compact man in a brown coat who had arrived 10 minutes earlier, and who had been speaking with one of Sir Edmund's associates near the door, was escorted across the room at this moment by Mr. Alford, who had a gift for being present at the right moment, and who had spotted what was happening with the interest of a man who enjoyed a well-constructed situation. The officer arrived at Aldermere's elbow. Aldemir turned to him. He took the letter gently from Cecily's hand and held it for the officer to see. He said, in the level, carrying voice of a man accustomed to being listened to in rooms, "This letter was found in the papers of the late Mr. Hartley, solicitor, who died in November last. It is in Thomas Morrow's hand, dated the 8th of October, and it directly refutes the debt document presented in Chancery. I would ask that you examine it before taking any further action this evening." The room had gone quiet. The room, which had been 300 conversations, was now one room waiting. Sir Edmund Foss had moved. He had come across the floor with the speed of a man whose production has been interrupted, and he stood now at Aldermere's left, and his face had the particular color of a man who has built a very solid structure and just heard it creak. "This is," Sir Edmund began, "an improper," and he did not finish. "The letter exists," Aldemere said, and his voice did not rise. "The estate case will now be reopened. Mr. Foss, I suggest you consult with your own solicitor this evening, rather than continuing present." The room breathed. Lady Haverwick, from her column, turned her head toward Cecily in the way of a woman revising a verdict she had delivered publicly and found suddenly inconvenient. Aldemere turned back to Cecily Morrow. The room was still watching. He looked at her with the directness of a man who has had 3 weeks to decide what he will say when the moment arrives, and has chosen his words with the care he gives to legal drafting, which is to say that every word is there because it is necessary. "The letter names her innocent," he said, so that the room could hear it. "I named her mine." 12 words. The room absorbed them the way rooms absorb irrevocable statements, in the held second before the exhalation. Miss Portia Foss set down her glass. Sir Edmund Foss looked at Aldemere for a long moment. Then he looked at the officer, who had the letter open in his hands, and was reading it with the careful attention of a man who understands that the paper he holds has just rearranged an evening. Then Sir Edmund Foss looked away, which was the only honest thing he had done in this room in many years. Cecily Morrow stood in the center of the assembly room in her 2-winter-old ivory gown, and felt the room's attention settle on her and shift in the way of a tide that has been running hard and has found at last the moment of its turning. She did not smile. She was not, in this moment, capable of smiling. She was simply breathing and holding the knowledge that she had been right. That she had been right all along, and that the machinery which had been built to make her doubt, it had been taken apart in the span of a minute by 11 steps and 12 words. She looked at Lord Aldemere, who was looking at her. "You have been carrying this for 3 weeks, she said. "Yes," he said. "You were at the printer's shop." "Yes." She looked at him for a long time. He waited. He was, she understood now, a man practiced in waiting at the right moment, rather than the procedurally convenient one. "You knew my father's handwriting," she said. "I learned it," he said, "from his letters." They were outside perhaps an hour later, on the pavement in front of Hargrove Assembly Rooms, in the interval that followed the immediate proceedings, the officer's assurances, the brief consultation with Mr. Alford, who had an acquaintance at the Chancery offices and would send word in the morning. The night was cool, and the street lamps threw their particular London light across the stones, and Cecily stood with her back to the building she had entered 2 hours ago as a woman preparing to be publicly destroyed. She was not destroyed. She turned the seal ring on its ribbon at her wrist, the way she turned it when she was thinking. "He would have liked you," she said. "My father. He read law for pleasure, which I always thought was peculiar. But I understand it better now. I would have liked him," Aldemere said. He was standing 2 proper steps away, which was the distance required by propriety, and which he maintained with the self-discipline of a man who is acutely aware of what he would prefer and has determined to deserve it first. He wrote with great care. Every sentence was considered. She looked at him. "You said a thing, in the room, to the officer." "Yes." "I named her mine," she said, which was not a question, but was clearly a question. The lamp nearest them made the shadow of the iron railing fall across the pavement in clean lines. Aldermere took a single step, which reduced the two proper steps to one. "I have been," he said, "attending to the matter for 3 weeks. I should have attended to it sooner. I have a habit of waiting for the correct procedural moment." He paused. "I have been trying to correct that habit." She looked at him. The seal ring was warm in her fingers. She thought of her father's handwriting on the 8th of October, careful and deliberate, a man setting down the truth of his accounts while he still had the clarity to do so. She thought of the letter traveling through a dead solicitor's papers to a locked box to this man's hands, and of him carrying it in his breast pocket for 3 weeks because he was waiting for the right moment and had finally understood what right required. She said, "There is a great deal I do not know about you." "There is a great deal I would like you to know," he said. She looked down at the ring, and then up at him. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something he has decided, quietly and without announcement, over the course of 3 weeks of assembly rooms and printers' shops and a rainy Thursday morning and a conversation about adverse possession, and the decision has the quality of finished work. She said, "Walk with me, then." He offered his arm. She took it. They walked down the lamplit street, and the night was cool, and the city was still making its various noises around them. And after a moment she said something about Hartley's papers, and he said something in return, and neither of them said anything about the ring on the ribbon at her wrist, because there was no need to. He had learned her father's handwriting from his letters. She had walked into a room prepared to be destroyed, and had come out of it with her name intact, and this man's arm under her hand. Her father would have called that a very favorable outcome. She thought he would have been right. The lamp at the corner of the street threw their shadows long ahead of them as they walked, and somewhere behind them the assembly rooms went on with their evening, and Sir Edmund Foss sat with his solicitor in a room off the main hall, and Lady Haverwick revised her verdict for the second time in an evening, which was unusual enough that she would remember it for years. Miss Portia Foss retrieved her cloak and sent for her carriage in the particular silence of a woman who has understood that the evening did not go as arranged. And Cecily Morrow walked toward the lamp at the corner with her father's ring warm against her wrist, and a man beside her who had been a stranger in the crowd until the moment he was not. And the night held them both in the way of a night that has witnessed something it will keep. If her father's story stayed with you, leave a word below. He earned it. She kept the letter. She kept the ring. By the following spring, when the Chancery case had been resolved and the offices restored and the season had opened to a woman whose name required no modification, she kept them both in the drawer of a desk in a house in Marylebone that she and Lord Aldermere had chosen together on a grey November morning, walking from room to room and finding reasons, room by room, to agree. The ring she wore on her finger now, properly, which is to say without the ribbon. The letter she kept folded in thirds in the drawer where she kept her father's correspondence, where it could rest alongside the letters written in the same careful hand, and where, on certain evenings, she could take it out and read it and know, in the specific way one knows things that have been earned rather than given, that her father had told the truth, and that the truth had waited for her. In the drawer next to her father's letters, folded in thirds, was a single page in a different hand, the hand she now knew well enough to read in the dark. It was not a love letter in the ordinary sense. It was a precise accounting of what he had found in Hartley's papers, and when, and what he had decided, and why he had not moved at the procedurally convenient moment, but had waited until the moment was correct. It ended with a sentence she had read many times and which still held its weight each reading. He had written, "She did not flinch." On the evening she discovered the page, she had been sitting at the desk in the Marylebone house while the fire made its particular November sounds, and the street outside was doing the thing London streets do in the cold, which is to go quiet for a few minutes together, as if considering a thought. And she had looked at the sentence for a long moment. Then she had looked up at the portrait on the wall across from the desk. The woman in the three-quarter pose who was Eleanor, whom she had never met, and who had died still accused. She understood him now, with the completeness of understanding that only arrives when you have been inside the same machinery and found the same thing waiting for you in it. She closed the drawer. The fire burned steadily. She sat in the quiet of the house and was, in the truest sense of the word, home.